stop for a few periodic like comprehension checks as I go through today's talk. I really got today excited about today's talk, not only to talk to you about my research, which I'm always terribly excited about, but also to talk about the methods that I'm using, which I think are so terribly interesting. And coming from a clinical background as I do, I know that when I was clinical, I really liked to be able to kind of understand the science and how it was being made. I'm just trying to organize my space so that I can look in the right spot. Okay. So thank you for coming to today's talk. I want to admit, full disclosure, I'm really bad at titles. So thank you for coming despite the title that we had put out there on the advert. At the end of today, this dancing, angry, thoughtful triangles angle that I'm using will make a lot more sense. Okay, so let's begin. I am doing my own personalized land acknowledgement. So I have this really incredible, oh, this is not mine, but there is this really incredible resource. You can see it down on the bottom right, native-land.ca. And what I have is a map of the territories, the Indigenous territories over top on which the settlers called Alberta. And here for your reference is Edmonton. So Glen Rose, where this presentation is taking part, as well as the University of Alberta, which is where I'm employed, are both in Edmonton on these lands, which the settlers called the Treaty 6 and the Métis Nation Zone 4 territories. So as you can see, these are the traveling and meeting grounds for many, as you can see, incredibly vibrant and dignified Indigenous cultures. I always reflect on how our relationship to the earth could be so much better if we embraced some Indigenous teachings. And I also like to think of how social, healthcare, and educational systems could benefit from embracing Indigenous teachings, ideologies, and practices. So I'm firmly committed to learning about and embracing truth and reconciliation, and to, whenever possible, incorporating Indigenous ways of knowing. Oh, now I don't know how to advance. See if it goes. Okay, so just some important points about today's talk. I'm going to be using identity first language for the most part. That's because in general, it is the general consensus of the highly verbal autistic community that they prefer the identity first language, although occasionally I will use person first language. Also, I want to just reflect for you that all of today's data that's being reported on was collected from highly verbal, intellectually able, autistic, and non-autistic adolescents. And so again, what I'm going to be reflecting on, the theories that I'm kind of starting to grow as my work comes together, it's really about all autistic individuals, but today's focus is really on highly verbal individuals. And I want to also accentuate that my work takes place through a neurodiversity lens. And that very basically just means that I believe they're not broken, something's just different. So when I started doing my research, there was a lot of autistic people can't do this or autistic people can't do that. And what my work is beginning to show, and when we reflect on previous research through this lens, what we can see is that there are these component skills within the autistic system. It's just there's some sort of breakdown somewhere that's leading to these characteristic differences we see in the behaviors. Okay, so let's begin. Without any further ado, I'm going to play this little video for you. It's a minute and a half long, but I'm only going to play about the first 30 minutes. And then just a heads up to everyone, mostly Lori, that I'm going to then be asking you to explain for me what you saw happening. So let's watch the first 30 seconds here. Okay, and so I'm just going to ask anyone to volunteer. I'm assuming it will be Lori. Just if you wanted to, Lori, just can you just describe what you saw happening in the video?
Sure. My interpretation of it is that this was an aggressive interaction. So it looked like the big triangle was maybe like a parent or some kind of authority figure, and the little triangle is like their kid or something, and they have a friend with them, and they asked maybe if the friend could come inside, and the triangle shook its head and said no. And then it looked like they had quite an aggressive interaction, and the little circle friend went to hide.
Right. Okay. So first I want to say there's actually no right or wrong answer. These are just geometric shapes moving around in space. So I'm also belatedly realizing, I don't know, many of you may only be on your phone on the way to somewhere. I don't know if anyone is actually just listening or can see the video, but what I showed was a video of geometric shapes like a triangle, a big triangle, little triangle, circle, just moving around in space. And what happened is when Lori interpreted it, she gave people-like characteristics to the shapes, which we all of us who were able to view it likely did do. So this seminal work back in the early 40s by Hyder and Simmel showed that there was a near universal tendency. They said universal, but one of their participants didn't do it. So all but one of their participants attributed human-like characteristics to these animations of these geometric shapes really just moving around. And they also attributed social meaning to the interactions between the shapes. And I want to highlight that these are just basic geometric shapes. It's just a small triangle. There's nothing added to the triangle to make it look human-like. There's no arms or legs or anything added. It's just these basic geometric shapes. But there's this near universal tendency for us to attribute human-like characteristics and to infer social interaction into these movements of these shapes. So about 6 decades later, approximately, there was a researcher at Princeton at the time, Amit Klein, and he was interested in how autistic individuals interpret the same kinds of stimuli. So he worked with 40 autistic individuals and 20 non-autistic individuals, and he matched them for not only non-verbal IQ, but he also matched on some verbal measures, which is really important to remember. Especially, I could reflect back on a lot of research in empathy, for example, or figurative language, where we weren't carefully matching the participants on language, even though we were asking them to use their language to complete the task. But this researcher, Klein, he did match them carefully on language. And then what he had all participants view the exact same videos that we just viewed. So it's a 1.5-minute video. He used the original videos from the Hyder and Simmel study, and every participant got to watch the video twice because he didn't want to be taxing their working memory. And then he had broken the video down into 6 short little segments, and each segment watched by itself was meaningful. There was some meaningfulness to it. So you would watch the video twice, and then you would watch the first segment, and you would report back as completely as possible what happened there. And then you would watch the second segment and you would report back, watch the third segment, and so on and so forth for all the segments. And so Amit Klein took all that information of what people had interpreted out loud as they were asked, what are you seeing here? And what he was able to do is he was able to study some different social cognitive domains and compare between the autistic and the non-autistic groups. So that's what I'm going to just reflect for you on the background of what he found in that study. And I do want to mention that he reports without any more detail. He just says that many of the autistic individuals describe the video solely in geometric terms. And he doesn't say how many of the autistic individuals did that. And he doesn't give any examples of what they mean. But I know from my own personal experience, as you'll see later in the study, that some of the participants in the study when I did something similar said things like the big triangle and the little triangle orbited the box, right? So no really social attribution in any way at all. Okay, so Klein was interested in, so what he did is he totaled up the total number, amount of things that people said, and then he was looking for certain themes or domains or dimensions of social cognitive interest, and he was going to compare between the group what percentage of this they were doing with their with what they had reported back. So one of the things that he looked at, first of all, was how much non-pertinent information people had included. And as we can see, the blue bars represent the autistic group. It's probably not a surprise to any of us who work with highly verbal autistic individuals that they included a lot more information that wasn't pertinent to the story or to the task that they were supposed to be doing. And that was a statistically significant difference. And then he was also interested in the social components within the movie. So when many non-autistic viewers have watched it and told their perceptions of it, there are about 20 important socialization type things where they label one of the characters as a human-like label, or they talk about those interactions between the shape as social interactions. There are 20 of those that are consistently used. And so Klein was just interested in the percentage of those that autistic and non-autistic groups are using. And this is where we see that not unexpected flip, that the non-autistic group is using a much higher percentage of these social components more often than the autistic group. I do also want to point out, though, in that mindset of neurodiversity, that the autistic participants were doing some of the socialization, including some of the social components. So it's not like the trait was absent. It was just reduced in comparison to the autistic group. Now I have this second axis set up just because I've expanded the y-axis here, just to show just so the bars can be a little bit taller so you can see the differences between the groups. So the other dimension that Amiel Klein was very interested in was theory of mind, cognitive type interactive verbs. So a cognitive theory of mind thing is when someone is planning or knowing or organizing. So how much do you understand about how someone else is planning or organization? And what he saw was that, again, not unexpected, the non-autistic group was using many more of these type terms that reflected this knowledge compared to the autistic group. And he also separated theory of mind into the affective type words, so social interaction type words, and feeling words. So how much do you know about what a person's feeling? Are you doing any actions where you want to influence how someone else is feeling? And again, not unexpected that not unexpected if you know autism and autism literature, but the autistic group was doing this significantly less often than the viewers who had observed the video who were non-autistic. But again, I want to just highlight for us that there were some cognitive theory of mind type words and interactions being used, right? So it's not like it was absent, it was just reduced in comparison to the non-autistic group. So the other thing that Klein was really interested in was trying to get a really nice measure of how much they actually made the characters seem like people, how much anthropomorphization or peopling of these objects and situations did they actually do. So this scale is out of 6. He created a very intricate scale out of 6, and he had, for each of these components, there were different levels, and depending on how many of each of the levels from each of the components, you would score out of 6. How much were you personifying? And I don't think it would be a surprise to anyone, again, to see that the autistic group was doing that significantly less than the non-autistic group. So we have that blue bar is significantly lower than the orange bar. But again, I don't mean to be harping on about it, but do notice that they were doing autistic people were doing some personification. So the skill is not absent or completely broken. It's just different than what's happening in the autistic group, in the non-autistic group. Okay, so I was very fortunate when I was doing my postdoc in Ireland that I had access to this updated version of a Hyder and Simmel-like video. And it was made for very similar reasons to the original videos. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to play about a minute for you of this video that I was working with, just so you get a picture of it, the updatedness of it. I'll start in just a second. I guess I can narrate a bit for the people who aren't seeing it. So the little boy, triangle, I call it a boy, has gone into a field and he's playing kick with himself. He's got a ball, he's kicking it back and forth to himself off the walls of the field. And then a big triangle shows up, probably a parent. It looks like he gives a shout. And then the kid leaves the field and goes to meet his parent, and they go off together. We see the field kind of morphs, it changes into a house. And then the next scene kind of begins where that parent triangle, the dad triangle, and the baby triangle show up back at the house. So what I want to just talk about is the stimulus and how our stimulus was a little bit the same, but also a little bit different. So one way in that it was the same, really importantly, is that there was no text presented ever, or no words. So we never showed words or text of what was happening. Participants never got to read a version of what we thought was happening in the story. And then we never said anything about the story. There was no verbal like back and forth between the characters. There's no words included in this at all, just the same as with the original study. But ours is slightly different. Ours is much longer. It's about 5 times as long. We had 7 minutes of video instead of just 1.5 minutes. And our video used both simple and complex geometric shapes. And so I'm just going to have a few visuals here of what those shapes were, what I mean by simple versus complex. So in this first illustration for you, what I have are just the very most simple geometric shapes. So it's just a triangle, nothing is added. It's in no way been morphed or changed to look like a human. It's just a simple triangle. We have the simple circle, which is a ball. And the field, it could be argued, is a simple geometric shape. It's actually a rectangle with one part of the rectangle open. But ours get a bit more complex. So later in the video, after you saw the rectangle morph into a house, the floorboards of the house during a dream sequence morph into birds. So these birds are simple representations of birds, but they're no longer just a simple basic geometric shape. It's now a shape, a representation of a bird made by two geometric shapes. And so we have several figures like that where they seem very simple, but I want you to keep in mind they're a bit more complex. They're not just a simple basic geometric shape. They're a representation of something we know in the world made out of simple geometric shapes. So example is the house, and very much later in the video, there's this monster. The house morphs into a monster, again, in one of the dream sequences. So I do want to highlight that for us, the main characters of the study, the 3 main characters of importance that we were looking at for Are They Personified, were a small triangle, which people often refer to as the boy, a big triangle or the parent, or sometimes called the dad or the father. And at the very end, there's a small square that is the friend. So big triangle, little triangle, and small square. Those are the 3 main characters that we were really interested in the movie. And they were those basic geometric shapes, not some of these more complex geometric shapes. And the other thing that was very different for us is that the viewers passively viewed this in the scanner. So our participants were lying in the MRI scanner, and we never said to them, we're going to ask you about this. And as a matter of fact, we do, which is one of the shortcomings of this story, actually. So they were just passively viewing it. They watched, 2 or 3 other similar kind of odd videos while they were in the scanner. So that was also very different. They weren't watching it with the intent of having to describe it verbally to anyone later. Okay, so here I have this 7 minutes of video, and I was really interested. What kind of social, emotional, or interactional information is being encoded in the brain while participants are viewing this? And am I going to be able to somehow get that out of the neuroimaging data? So when you get talks about neuroimaging data, and again, I hope a lot of people can see my slides, but for those of you who can, I just have this very classic representation on the slide where we have that picture of the structures of the human brain. And on top of that, we have these glowing blobs that represent generally where activation is. And so I call this blobology, and it was been very, very fabulous and has been able to teach us a lot, and we learn a lot from it. But today I'm not focusing on this kind of analysis of neuroimaging research. Instead, what I'm looking at is patterns of activation, and I'm using computer models of language to add some extra nuance or sensitivity to the analysis. So I'm going to talk to you a bit about computational modeling and how I do that, because again, I think it's so fascinating, and it's happening in a lot of fields right now. So you'll be learning a lot about findings that are coming out of computational modeling. So I think it's fun to understand it a bit. And in order for me to kind of talk you through the study and how I did it, I'm just going to quickly define for you the word voxel. So you can think of a voxel in neuroimaging is the same idea as a pixel when we're talking about resolution on a TV screen. So when you have a 2-dimensional screen, each little square that makes up the whole is called a pixel. And a voxel is the exact same thing in neuroimaging, except we have a cube of space that we're collecting. So when participants are in the scanner, We collect the entire cube of space around their brain that encapsulates their space. And we collect that in tiny little cubes of space, so tiny little cubes making up this bigger cube. So that's a voxel. That's a representation of resolution in neuroimaging space. And I have this second visual, which just shows a very classic representation of how we usually present our results on a image of a brain. But you can see that each one of those, the way we make up the information is by collecting in these tiny little parcellations of space called a voxel. So when we're talking about voxels in the brain, it's just kind of the same resolution as pixels on a screen. Okay, so there's some real huge benefits to computational modeling that because science has moved forward in terms of computation and also neuroimaging science, we're now able to do some much more incredible things. So one of the benefits of computational modeling is that I can now look at real-time stimuli, meaning something like a movie that's just free-flowing, or you can listen to an audio podcast, for example. So previously, when we were doing blobology, what we would have to do, if for a visual example, is I would have to give a static image, so like a photo or a picture, and then I would have to wait a little bit because we know the brain science, the brain signal is delayed. And then I would show the next slide, and then I would wait a second, and then I would show the next one, and so on and so forth for the entire period of time. And there was many other confusing factors because there's so much noise in neuroimaging signal that you wanted them to see the same picture at least 10 times across the whole study. And so it was quite artificial and not at all like a real social experience. So we were trying to study social cognition and social understanding in this not completely realistic way. But with computational modeling now, we can use this real-time stimuli. So I can show this video from start to end as you would view it naturally and start to eke out and get some understanding about how your brain is recreating what's happening in the brain to create that experience for you. And it also has a much greater sensitivity than blob analysis. So I'm only going to obsess about one part of this for you. But when we do the blob analysis, we're always only looking for where activation is going up. That's one of the limitations of it. And we usually are having to look for very good mathematical and scientific reasons. We're looking for those groups of voxels together. So we look for groups of voxels that are close together where they're all moving up about the same amount in response to a certain stimuli over and over and over. But computational modeling doesn't have those limitations. For computational modeling, I'm looking at all 256,000 voxels at the same time. And I'm saying, is there any pattern of any kind anywhere? So are some voxels going up while others go down? Are some voxels going up just before other ones go down? Or are two of them staying the same all the time and then one going up, one going down? So we're looking at all voxels across the whole brain. There's no longer that spatial restriction. And also the signal can be going up or down or staying steady. All of that is important and plays into these patterns that we end up looking for. Okay, so that's what I'm doing. I have 7 minutes of neuroimaging data, and I'm going to be looking for patterns in the data that reflect what was happening in the movie. And I make it sound so easy. So I'm going to describe for you in the most simple terms, I think, that are going to help you understand how do I do that. So what I have is I have this representation of the brain taken from a study, this Huth et al. Study. I used, this was a pioneering paper in computational modeling of language. And I used his methods and his analytical methods throughout. So this is just an image that he had used in his paper. It's just a line drawing of a brain. The eyes would be over here for anyone who's interested in orientation. This is the back of the brain. But what's important here is we're just giving this example of reminding you that we're thinking on a voxel by voxel basis. So we just have 3 voxels, for example, highlighted. And usually, as I said, when we're collecting the data, there are about 256,000 voxels that we're collecting for at a time. So what we do is every 2 seconds in the MRI scanner, I collect an entire big volume of that whole brain. So all those voxels in 2 seconds, it sounds just like this. Every 2 seconds, that's exactly what the scanner sounds like for anyone who's been in one. Every 2 seconds, I collect this entire volume of data, so a signal for what's happening in every single voxel in the brain, and we call that a TR. And I just do that over and over and over again for the whole 7 minutes that the video is playing. And if you do the math for my study, that meant I had 210 collections. I had 210 TRs. Every 2 seconds, I have all information for all 256,000 voxels. What is the signal in that voxel during this part of the movie, this 2 second chunk? Okay, and then to make that a little bit easier for myself, or to imagine how we might start to think about the data, I can just think of one voxel at a time. I can go into that voxel for every TR, and I can just say, okay, like what was the number, what was the signal in that voxel during this TR? So I can just plot it, and then I say, okay, what was the signal at TR2, TR3, TR4, TR5, and so on and so forth. And what I get is I just get this time series of data of what was the activation in that voxel over this entire time period. So I've tried to draw a somewhat representative squiggle where it looks kind of like the purple active was fairly, the purple voxel was fairly active near the beginning, but it was kind of lazy, not doing much, maybe just drifting during the middle, and then was active again near the end. So that's just to give you kind of a representation of how we can start to understand how the voxel was influenced at different points of the movie. But also, please remember that there are actually going to be 256,000 of these lines like stacked on top of each other when we're trying to understand the whole range. So it gets very complicated. It's very high dimensional, which is why some of these analyses are only possible since computational models have evolved and matured. Okay, now, so in order to be able to compare the neuroimaging data, that data from the brain, to the information in the movie, I have to set those two bits of information up into kind of the same shape. So that's what I do. So for the movie, what I do is I go through and I make a list of all the interesting labels, not all the interesting labels, all the labels. So all the actions and items and social things in the movie that are happening. And I just list them. So ball, at one time the boy's happy, he's in the field. So ball, happy, field, blah, blah, blah. I just go through and make this list of labels. And for each label, I again just go through each 2 second chunk and each TR, and I can just say, is the ball visible in this TR? If it's visible, I give it a 1. And if it's not visible, I give it a 0, which is the same as telling the system it's blank. So I just have this representation. For example, the word ball, it shows up a bit at the beginning, and then there isn't a ball for a long time. And then at the end, there's another ball. It's a different ball, but it's still just the label of the word ball when they're shooting it at the monster. It shows up later. And again, I do this for all the labels in the movie. And this is just another example, a label, the label monster, which shows up very late in the movie. So this is just giving the same shape representation to tell the computer system this stimulus, this part of the stimulus monster is not at all present, and then suddenly it is present, and then it's not present again. So that's what I'm doing, is I'm putting this brain information into this shape. So here I have it represented as a matrix from the movie Matrix for all of those funny video people out there. So we have that 7 minutes, all those TRs, boom, boom, boom along the top. And then all the way down the y-axis here, I have the just every single voxel, all 256,000 of my voxels. And again, I wanted the information from the movie to be in the same kind of shape. So again, across the top, I have every single TR, boom, 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 boom. And then for each label, just at each point in the movie, I just say either it was present or it wasn't present. So we make the information from the neuroimaging and the movie into the same shape so that we can then tell how fluctuations in the movie data are related to fluctuations we see in the neuroimaging data. So in order to do that, this is my representation. We do some math. Boom, 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 boom. We do lots of exciting math. And I'm not going to bore you with any of the math. And what we end up with in the end is we end up with a loading factor. So this math, all this math we do, is basically kind of like a regression. So you can think of a loading factor like a regression coefficient, meaning if it's a positive coefficient, that the fluctuation in one was positively related to the fluctuation in the other. They were both going up at the same time, for example. And the magnitude is the same way, the same interpretation. So the higher the magnitude of the loading factor, the more strongly these things were related. Okay, and so I said I wasn't going to bore you with the math, but I am going to go through just one tiny little detail in that I told you that we first aligned all the information from the movie by doing it label by label by label by label. But what I wanted to do is I wanted to understand more carefully in the path of the work Klein had done and also Huth. I wanted to understand some of those social cognitive dimensions or concepts that we know are important or salient to humans who are interpreting things. So for example, in the Ami Klein study, he was really interested in personification of those shapes. And so I wanted to highlight those three main characters as a group so that I could say in the movie, here is when this dimension of main characters is happening. So I just did that by aligning my data up so that all the things that were main characters were included in this group, for example, and everything else wasn't included. And I did the same because of the Klein study. I wanted a feelings or a theory of mind type interactions dimension to be looking at to try and see if that was present in the neuroimaging data. And from Huth et al., as I said, he did some pioneering work on understanding how we can understand what's happening in terms of language in the brain. From the Huth et al. Study, he noticed that animacy is a very salient characteristic or category for humans who are interpreting stuff. So meaning things that move of their own accord, things like the boy, the parent, the friend, the monster, these things are moving on their own. Size also happens to be very important when humans are interpreting moving stimuli. So if it's much, much bigger than a human, we would give it a 1. If it's about the size of a human, it gets a 0.5. If it's smaller than a human or not, it doesn't have any shape, like emotion doesn't have shape, it would be a 0. And also things that can move regardless of whether they're moving by themselves or being moved by other people, that also happens to be an important dimension of something that's really salient in the human brain as they're viewing things. And finally, I was also interested for this movie specifically how the brain was responding when things were morphing. So we have that the field morphs into a house, which at some points in time spins like a clock to indicate the passage of time, and eventually it morphs into this monster. So all I did was I converted these labels, these bit by bit labels, I just converted them into dimensions, which were in kind of encapsulating these important social cognitive things I was interested in. Okay, and as I said, we get this loading factor. And so that's what I'm going to present to you now, the findings of the study. So the loading factor is along the y-axis, and along the x-axis, I have these different dimensions of interest that I was interested in. And I'm going to first show you what was most salient, or we could capture the most variation. So which dimension was most salient, does anyone want to guess, for the non-autistic group? Out of where the main character is most salient was animacy, size, mobility, feelings or theory of mind or social interaction, or when things were changing. Anyone want to guess? Okay, well, I'll reveal it. So not surprising, the feelings or theory of mind or when social interactions were occurring, those were the parts of the movie that seem to be most salient. So I'm using this interpretation, most salient, to be we could capture the most variance of what was happening in the neuroimaging data when we were trying to find information related to this dimension. So I thought that was really exciting. And when we compare that to the blue line, the line representing what's happening in the autistic group, we can see that there is less information, we can capture less information related to feelings, theory of mind, social interaction in the autistic group compared to the non-autistic group. I do want to state that I have not yet done the statistical comparisons between these. I'm working on the permutations, but they take a long time. So we can't say for certain that this is like statistically significantly less, but we're seeing this pattern of less in the autistic group. And I would leave a couple seconds to let you guess. Maybe you have already been trying to wonder what would be most salient in the autistic group. And those three main characters, those three main shapes that are basic geometric shapes moving around in these ways that non-autistic people are attributing human-like characteristics to, are what we're most salient or using up so much energy or really being focused on in the autistic brain. And what is a fascinating comparison for me is when I reveal how much of that same kind of focus was given from the non-autistic group, we can see a very stark difference here. The fact that those shapes were moving as they were just wasn't eating up as much brain energy is maybe how we can talk about it compared to how it was affecting the autistic group or what was happening for the autistic observers. Okay, so the other one that's kind of in the same vein, in the similar way of interest, is that for the autistic group, when things were moving of their own accord, that seemed to be really fascinating the autistic brain, if I'm allowed to personify a brain in that way, much more so than for the non-autistic group. And then in the reverse, we see that when things were morphing and changing, like from the house changes into the monster, that was really salient to the non-autistic viewers, to the neuroimaging, for what we were able to get out of the neuroimaging data from the non-autistic viewers compared to that blue bar, that autistic viewers. And so the middle two, size and mobile, so how big things were and whether they were moving, whether they were moving if they could move, those seem, the comparisons, again, not statistically done yet, they seem a little less obvious, less of a difference between the groups. And so I ordered these dimensions, main characters, anim, size by size, in decreasing salience for the autistic group. So what was really striking for me is when I looked at the profile of what was salient for the autistic group, starting with the fact that there are these shapes moving around, compared to what was salient for the autistic group or the non-autistic group, I keep doing that today, sorry, we see this very, very different profile, almost opposite profiles for what is salient in one group compared to the other. Okay, so that's all really incredible. And people were saying to me, so does that mean they're thinking triangle? Does that mean the autistic group is thinking in these geometric terms? But we actually can't answer that from the analysis I just showed you. So what I did is I did another kind of analysis that allowed me to answer that question. Or I think it allowed me to answer the question. That's what I was trying to do. Okay, so this neuroimaging approach, I'm going to look at, can I decide whether they were thinking boy versus whether they were thinking triangle, or is that how they were interpreting? Were they interpreting in terms of the meaning of the word boy or in the meaning of the word triangle? And I do that through an approach called encoding. I'm just trying to differentiate it from the regression type approach I did before. And just to set up the information in the same way for you, what I do is instead of keeping it all as one giant matrix, I split it into tiny little bits of information. So each TR, right, each one of those 2-second chunks of neuroimaging information gets its own matrix this time. And I want to do the same thing for the behavior, the stimulus, the information, the stimulus. Now, as I said, in the study, people never see text or they're never hearing anyone say any words. But as a study team, I do have a verbal representation, a written representation of what the person who made the video thinks is happening in the video. And so what I do is I go through and I watch each TR and I say, okay, well, which part of what's this description of what's happening in the video is happening in which TR. And that's all I do is I assign each of these bits of information to each TR. So I'm not going to go into this in detail, but computers don't actually understand language. And so what I do is I put it through a computer model of language, meaning it changes language, words, into a long line of numbers that represents the meaning of this sentence, okay? And again, I can come back and do a whole conversation on this really incredible way that we try and understand language in this way. One of the fun things that can happen is while I'm telling this computer model of language, you know, get the meaning of the word boy, the meaning of the word then get the meaning of the word boy, then get the meaning of the word and average it all together to give me this long line of numbers that represents the meaning of the sentence. I can tell it to do that just considering one word at a time, beep, boop, one context length of 0, just consider one word at a time. But we know actually that the human brain, it doesn't just do one word at a time. It kind of, the words end up feeding off of each other, right? So I can also change the context length of the model. And I can say to the model, well, tell me about the word, tell me about the meaning of this sentence in the same way. But this time when you get the meaning of the word boy to add to the average, consider the fact that the word before the word boy was the word the, right? And when you get the meaning of the word and, consider the fact that the word before the word and was the word boy. So we start to be able to incorporate context similarly to the way that we know the human brain does it. And so we can do that for 2, for 5, for any amount of context that we want to do of the words preceding the word that I'm asking it to get this computer meaning for. And so I do have in this, this last study I'm going to show you about, I was interested in that context length. If we increase context length, can we get more information? Are we better at guessing what the brain would be doing if it was looking at the meaning based in this way? And so I did that a whole bunch of times at all those different context lengths using the sentence that had the word boy in it. So the meaning of this sentence where the sentence had the word boy. And then I did it all again, but instead of I used the exact same sentence, but instead of boy, I used the meaning of the word triangle. And so the meaning of the word triangle gets incorporated into this sentence. So here's just the example. Instead of the and boy and his and all averaging together, it has the meaning of the word triangle that gets incorporated. Okay, and so I just have this same visual representation where those each TR for the brain imaging data is by itself. And then I get the information from the movie gets its own, what's happening for that TR gets its own like chunk or whatever. And this is how we set it up when we do an encoding analysis. And again, I'm going to skip all the awesome, interesting, very fun and exciting math. And what you need to know is that at the end, we get an encoding performance. So how good can we guess what the brain data should look like if this is the meaning I'm telling the computer model that was being seen in the movie? And so what I have is on the y-axis for both of these graphs, I have encoding performance. So the higher the encoding performance, the better we were at our representation of what we said was happening in the movie represents how the brain was responding. And again, I'm looking at these 5 different context lengths, if I consider 2 words of context or 5 words or 10 words. So when I reveal the solid lines, that's when we were looking at the meaning of the word boy. And what we have in the non-autistic group is we have this really interesting pattern where more context does help, but only up until a certain point, and then it kind of levels off. So now if I look for the same in the autistic group, if we think of the traditional perception that autistic individuals are, they over-focus on detail, they don't necessarily comprehend things as a whole, then we would expect to have just a very flat line in the autistic group, even though I'm increasing context. But we don't see that. What we see is that my ability to understand or to account for what's happening in the brain variation, it increases in a strikingly similar pattern to the non-autistic group. And as a matter of fact, when I looked at both these graphs, I thought maybe I had plotted the same numbers in different colors, but I didn't. It's just that similar. Okay, so now what I'm going to show you is I'm going to show you the difference in the non-autistic group. I'm going to plot for you a hashed line that shows you what's happening, how much information I can get out of the neuroimaging data when I use the meaning of the word triangle. And what you can see in this hashed line is that it looks visually like it's above the meaning of the word boy, but really when I do the stats, there's no main effect of the encoding type. So the meaning of the word triangle is there, which makes sense because if you said to me, oh, well, what shape was the little boy? I would have said triangle, right? The meaning is there, but it seems like these 2 bits of information are coming as an inseparable package. They're kind of arriving together inseparably. And now when we switch and when we look at the autistic group, and I'm going to show you the hash line of what's happening when we use the meaning of the word triangle, what we find is the statistically significant greater ability for us to decode what's happening, to understand more information of the variation in the neuroimaging data in the autistic group when we use the meaning of the word triangle. So here we have this clear separation of that social part of the signal, the fact that it's being referred to as a boy, the non-social part of the signal, the fact that it's just a triangle. They're clearly separated in the analysis. They're separable in the autistic brain, whereas it doesn't seem to be that they are separable in the non-autistic group. And we did get a main effect. So that's a statistically significant difference. And I think really, luckily we're near the end because someone's calling for his mommy, but that really is what I want to, it's the kit and caboodle of this whole very incredibly, very interesting study is that the social signal, the social part of the signal, the fact that we're referring to it as a boy, as a human doing something. And the non-social part of the signal, the fact that it's just a triangle, it's just a geometric shape, those two components are existing in both autistic and non-autistic people, right? It's not broken, it's not missing for the autistic group. But the fact that the signal is separable in the autistic group is potentially, we could talk about in the next 5 to 10 minutes, why we end up seeing, why the separate signal in the autistic group can be leading to some of the autistic-like signs, traits and characteristics that we see when we're observing what's happening in autistic-like behavior. Okay, and I mean, that's my main conclusion from this study and from some of the other work I'm doing. It has all this same theme of the separable signal, the social and the non-social signal, both present in the autistic group, but just separable so that they're creating, a bit more confusion instead of coming as a package. I should have a good visual for that on that last slide. Okay, so thanks to everybody, my current postdoc supervisors, the lovely adolescents that I worked with that went in the scanner and completed all my tasks. Melech is an incredible computing science undergrad with whom none of this would have actually gotten done in time. Some funding sponsors important to me and my supervisors. And as I said, this was collected while I was at Trinity College in Dublin.
All right, awesome. Thanks so much, Brie. I'm just going to stop the recording now.